On May 7, 1915, the heir to America's most ruthless financial empire gave away his life jacket and drowned. His ancestor was famous for the phrase, "The public be damned," but he died saving that very same public on the sinking Lusitania. This man built a paradise here. He wanted to hide from the entire world. He created a perfect illusion of silence. But his final heroic act forever turned this place into a house with a ghost. And today, we'll show you how America's dirtiest money, its primary toxic asset, became the foundation for this forest fairy tale. Do you think this is just a story about a beautiful house? No. This is a story about whether you can build a paradise on a foundation of hell, and whether you can escape your destiny by building the most expensive cage on earth for yourself. We see this landscape as a postcard from the past, a perfect harmony of wood and water, the laughter of tourists echoing off the ancient pines. It seems this place is the very embodiment of tranquility, a man-made Eden born from a love for nature. But this harmony is a lie, a perfectly staged illusion, paid for with a fortune that reeked of steel, coal, and sweat. Every stone here, every polished log, is a silent witness to one of the most brutal financial wars in American history. And at the center of this illusion is him, Alfred Vanderbilt. This man never laid a single mile of railroad. He never founded a single company, never crushed a single competitor. He was a master of only one thing, the art of spending money earned by his ruthless ancestors. He was a fugitive from the shadow of America's most predatory dynasty, from a surname that had become synonymous with merciless capitalism. His entire life was a desperate attempt to prove that a Vanderbilt was not just a wolf of the stock market, but also a gentleman. And here is the main paradox. How did it happen that he, the heir to an empire built on the principle of the public be damned, created this monument to solitude and serenity in the impassable wilderness of the Adirondack forests? He was searching for silence. He built an entire forest kingdom to wall himself off from the noise of the world, from the scandals of his personal life, from the ghost of his great-grandfather, the Commodore. But the world found him. His greatest ambition, to live the quiet, inconspicuous life of an English aristocrat, was cut short by the loudest, most public act of heroism imaginable. He built his fortress in the woods to hide from history, but his fate caught up with him in the middle of the icy waters of the Atlantic, witnessed by hundreds of people, forever turning his creation into a house with a ghost. And from the very moment the ocean closed over his head, Sagamore ceased to be just a camp for the rich. It became a monument, a sarcophagus for a dream of silence, built by a man whose final cry was heard by the entire world. This is not a story about how houses are built. This is a story about whether you can escape your destiny by building the most beautiful and most expensive cage on earth for yourself. To understand this forest idol, you have to descend into hell. Not a mythical hell, but the one that seethed on the streets and in the ports of 19th century America. Because the foundation of Sagamore was not laid in the calm soil of the Adirondacks. It was laid in the filth of New York's docks, in the coal dust of railroad depots, and on the stock exchange floor, where cries of despair sounded louder than factory whistles. This silence was bought with a deafening roar, the roar of an empire built by one man. His name was Cornelius Vanderbilt, but history remembers him by his nickname, the Commodore. He started with a single old ferry, bought for $100, and from the very first day, he behaved not like a businessman, but like a pirate. He didn't build, he seized. He didn't create new markets. He suffocated existing ones, declaring price wars that turned his competitors' ships into rotting junk at the piers. For him, business wasn't creation. It was a form of predation, where the winner took all and the loser disappeared. Then he turned his gaze to the land, to the nation's steel arteries, the railroads. And here, his predatory genius reached its zenith. He didn't invent locomotives. He bought up and devoured entire companies, creating a monopoly that had the entire economy of the East Coast by the throat. Every dollar that filled his treasury was torn from a farmer who overpaid for grain transport, from a small industrialist crushed by tariffs, from thousands of nameless workers for whom safety regulations were an empty line in a report. In 1863, he orchestrated a financial guillotine known as the Harlem Corner. By manipulating stocks, he lured the most daring Wall Street speculators into a trap and coldly ruined them. He proved that he could control not only rails and ships, but the very lifeblood of capitalism, money. This original sin, this philosophy of total war against all, was inherited by his son. When a journalist asked him about social responsibility, William Vanderbilt uttered the phrase that became the dynasty's motto, its creed: "The public be damned." This is the metal from which the money Alfred Vanderbilt would use to build his forest fairy tale was forged. It wasn't just funds. It was a toxic asset, soaked in arrogance and contempt. It was a cursed inheritance, a brand. And Alfred, a man of a completely different nature, a gentleman, a sportsman, an aesthete, would spend his entire life trying to wash that brand away. He wouldn't build railroads. He would build a refuge. He wouldn't conquer markets. He would try to earn forgiveness by transforming America's dirtiest money into something pure and beautiful. But could he not have known that you can't build a paradise on such a foundation? You can only build a very beautiful prison. This architecture speaks two languages at once. On the outside, it whispers a story of modesty, of unity with nature. Uncut logs, rough boulders, roofs made of bark. All of it masquerades as a pioneer's dwelling, a forest cabin that seems to have grown out of this very land. But this is a carefully constructed lie, because inside, this same architecture screams. It screams of power, of boundless wealth, and of the complete subjugation of wild nature to the will of man. The idea for this grand deception was not Vanderbilt's. He merely bought it, ready-made and brilliantly packaged. The author was another man, William West Durant, the son of a railroad magnate, a visionary obsessed with the dream of creating a new style for the new American aristocracy. He called it the Adirondack Great Camp. But in essence, it was an oxymoron embodied in wood and stone. Primitive luxury. Durant's philosophy was simple and cynical. He sold the super-rich not houses, but a fantasy. The fantasy that one could return to one's roots, to a simple life in the bosom of nature, without sacrificing a single habit of civilization. His clients could sit by a gigantic fireplace built of wild stone and read a book by the light of an electric lamp. They could sleep in a log cabin, but on silk sheets, and take a bath in a porcelain tub filled with hot water from their own plumbing system. Durant understood the main secret of the Gilded Age. The further the elite detached themselves from reality, the more they wanted to play at simplicity. He built them giant theatrical sets where they could play the role of rugged frontier conquerors, knowing that backstage, an army of servants, a French chef, and an ice house packed with champagne awaited them. When Alfred Vanderbilt came here and saw the unfinished camp that had bankrupted Durant, he wasn't just buying land and buildings. He was buying a ready-made ideology, a ready-made script for his life. It was the perfect solution to his main problem. He didn't want to be like his ancestors. Their power was loud, dirty, urban. It reeked of coal smoke and stock market panic. Alfred wanted a quiet, clean, aristocratic power. He wanted to be not an industrial baron, but a forest king. And this architecture was his coronation statement. It told the world, "My ancestors conquered cities and markets. They laid steel paths through mountains. I will go further. I will conquer wild nature itself. I will turn it into a private park, an exquisite backdrop for my perfect life." He had found the ideal place to escape the shadow of his family. But he failed to consider one thing. To build his paradise on this spot, he would have to walk over the ruins of another man's dream. Before Alfred Vanderbilt became king of this forest, another monarch reigned here. A king born into luxury, but who died in near poverty. His name was William West Durant, and this land was his obsession, his passion, and his curse. His father, Thomas Durant, was one of those titans who laid railroads across the continent, stitching the country together with threads of steel and stuffing their pockets with gold. William, his son, inherited the money, but not the predator's instinct. He was an artist, not an accountant. Instead of multiplying capital on Wall Street, he came to this wilderness to spend it on creating his own universe, a universe of logs and moss. He wasn't just an architect. He was a demiurge, obsessed with the idea of creating a new style for the new American aristocracy. And each of his great camps was more expensive and grander than the last. He spent the family fortune with the extravagance of a European prince building Versailles. He believed his genius would pay for it all. Sagamore wasn't just a project. It was his obsession, his swan song. The last, most grandiose bet in a game he was already losing. He poured everything he had left, and more, into these log buildings. He went into debt. He mortgaged everything he could, believing this masterpiece would be his salvation. But he was building his castle on financial sand, and the blow came from where he least expected it. Not from the banks, not from the creditors, from his own sister. Accusing him of squandering the family fortune, she took him to court. The newspapers savored the details. The fallen king of the Adirondacks, the builder of forest palaces, was publicly humiliated by his own blood. The lawsuit was the final nail in his financial coffin. He was broken. He was bankrupt. He was forced to sell his soul, and a buyer was already waiting at the gates. Alfred Vanderbilt paid $162,500. For Durant, it was the price of his shattered dream, a symbol of his defeat. For Vanderbilt, a sum comparable to the cost of a new stable. He didn't buy a house, he bought a trophy. He took the crown from a vanquished monarch, paying almost nothing for it. Durant built the stage for a perfect life, but never got to play the lead role. Now, a new actor was entering this stage, an actor with an unlimited budget, ready to turn another's tragedy into his personal triumph. Alfred Vanderbilt took possession not just of a house, but of an entire kingdom. But this kingdom was isolated from the world, like a lost island. And before he could enjoy the silence, he had to win a war against distance. We tend to think of luxury as something light, ephemeral. But here, in the Adirondacks, every detail of comfort had its weight in tons and was measured in miles of grueling travel. It was a logistical operation comparable to supplying a small army. It all began on the steel tracks built by his grandfather. Trains from New York brought more than just building materials here. They brought civilization, packed in crates. A Steinway grand piano, wrapped in dozens of layers of felt to survive the jolting. Porcelain bathtubs from England, each weighing as much as 3 grown men. Crates of Chinese porcelain, Bohemian crystal, and silver cutlery, tons of coal for steam heating and kerosene for lamps. But the railroad only went so far. There, civilization ended, and the logistical hell began. The last 90 miles were torture. What had traveled in comfort on rails was now reloaded onto wagons pulled by teams of 6 horses. These caravans crept slowly along roads that were little better than forest trails. In summer, the wheels sank in mud. In autumn, the wagons broke on the ruts. A journey that takes an hour and a half by car today was then stretched out over agonizing days. Every luxury item that arrived at Sagamore was the result of a small military victory. A victory over the roadless terrain, over the weather, over wild nature itself. And in winter, the most dangerous phase began. When the lakes froze, they turned into ice highways. And then, heavy sleighs were sent across them. They carried giant steam boilers for the boiler house, beams for new buildings, furniture. The drivers prayed the ice would hold. Every crack beneath the runners was a harbinger of disaster, capable of swallowing the cargo, the horses, and the men in seconds. This was the dark side of primitive luxury, so that Alfred Vanderbilt and his guests could enjoy the illusion of a simple life. Dozens of men and animals risked their own. Every cup of fine china from which they drank their tea was soaked in the sweat and fear of those who brought it here. Vanderbilt wasn't just expanding the camp. He was laying the arteries of his power into the very heart of the wilderness, and each of these arteries was laid through pain, perseverance, and titanic labor that the guests sitting by the fire never even suspected. Logistics was only the first front line. The main enemy wasn't distance, but the land itself. This ancient, rocky Adirondack soil was not going to surrender without a fight, and the construction of Sagamore turned into a veritable war with the planet. Here, nature dictated its terms with the cruelty of a dictator. In winter, it turned this land into a frozen hell. The mercury in the thermometers dropped to 30 below zero, and sometimes even lower. The wind cut to the bone. Metal became as brittle as glass, and wood as hard as steel. The builders, recruited from nearby villages and towns, lived in temporary, hastily constructed barracks. Warming themselves with primitive stoves, they would wake up to see their breath freezing as frost on the walls. Working in such conditions wasn't just hard, it was life-threatening. But winter was only one of this enemy's faces. In the spring, when the snow melted, the land turned into an impassable swamp. And after that came summer, and with it, a new torment. Billions of black flies and mosquitoes rose from the forest floor. They swarmed into their eyes, noses, and ears. Their bites turned skin into a burning sieve. For the aristocrats in their hammocks, it was an annoying inconvenience. For the workers, drenched in sweat under the scorching sun, it was a daily torture. And beneath this hostile surface lurked an even more stubborn adversary. Rock, granite boulders, left behind by a glacier thousands of years ago. The engineers hired by Vanderbilt faced what seemed like an impossible task: to lay modern plumbing and sewage in ground that froze several feet deep in winter and met the pickaxe and shovel with unbreakable rock in summer. Every foot of trench was won from nature with dynamite, sweat, and blood. Explosions echoed through the valley, frightening the wild animals. These were the salutes of civilization, which was forcing its way with fire and strength where it wasn't wanted. They waged war on the land to create the illusion of harmony with it. This struggle embedded a deep contradiction into the very essence of Sagamore. It was meant to be a symbol of unity between man and nature, but it was born from an act of violence against it. Every comfort, every modern detail of this forest paradise was paid for with scars left on the body of this land, scars that are now hidden beneath moss and grass, but which remember the story of this merciless battle. This paradise for the chosen few was built by the hands of those whom history has chosen to forget. They are the invisible army of Sagamore, lumberjacks, masons, carpenters, diggers, local farmers who left their fields for a meager but steady income, Irish and Italian immigrants whose names have been erased from memory, but whose fingerprints remain forever on these logs and stones. Their world began where the master's world ended. Their reality was the underside of the luxurious life they were creating. We see photographs of Alfred Vanderbilt and his guests, posing relaxed on the porches. But we almost never see those who built these porches, those who, using horses, levers, and primitive pulleys, lifted 1,000-kilogram boulders to build a fireplace where a man would warm himself who could spend more on a single dinner party than any of these workers earned in a year. This colossal social divide was not just the backdrop of the construction, it was its foundation, an architectural principle. The very layout of the camp was designed so that these two worlds, the world of the masters and the world of the servants, would never intersect. They had separate dining halls, separate bedrooms, even separate paths leading to the same buildings. The army of cooks, maids, grooms, and gamekeepers was supposed to operate like a flawless but invisible mechanism. The guests' illusion of seclusion and serenity was maintained by the daily, exhausting labor of dozens of people who remained behind the scenes. Their work didn't end with the construction. It merely changed its form. They chopped wood for dozens of fireplaces. They hauled tons of ice from the lake to fill the ice house. They cleaned hundreds of pairs of boots, dirtied with forest mud. They rowed the boats while the guests fished, and they remained silent. They were taught to be shadows. It is in this contrast that the bitterest truth of the Gilded Age lies. Its gleam would have been impossible without this darkness. Its leisure would have been impossible without this grueling labor. Sagamore is not just a monument to one man's wealth. It is a monument erected on the invisible foundation of thousands of man-hours, paid at the lowest possible rate. This is a story that the tourist brochures don't tell, but it is the one that reverberates with a deep echo in every swing of an axe, in every creak of the floorboards. It is the story that every utopia has its price, and it is always paid by those who will never be invited into that utopia. Power isn't just about money. Power is control over the elements, over darkness, over silence. And as Alfred Vanderbilt built his forest kingdom, he wasn't just battling stone and wood. He was battling for light and for a voice. For the rest of the world at the turn of the century, electricity was still a novelty, a luxury of big cities. Here, in the heart of the wilderness, it was akin to a miracle. And Vanderbilt decided to create this miracle for himself. On the lake that supplied the entire camp, his engineers built a private hydroelectric power station. It was a bold engineering solution for such a remote wilderness. They subjugated the power of falling water, forcing it to turn a turbine, which in turn gave birth to light. While neighboring villages plunged into primeval darkness, illuminated only by kerosene lamps and candles, dozens of electric lights blazed in the windows of Sagamore. This was not merely a convenience. It was an act of power, a declaration. We are civilization. We bring light to where darkness reigns. With the flick of a switch, we can dispel the night shadows that have held absolute dominion over this forest for thousands of years. Every lit bulb was a symbol of technology's victory over nature, of wealth's victory over isolation. But light was not enough. Vanderbilt needed a voice. He was building a refuge from the world, but he didn't want to lose his connection to it. He needed to hear stock market reports from New York, accept invitations to the races in Saratoga, and give orders to his managers. And so he accomplished another technological feat. His workers, like army signalmen, laid 16 miles of private telephone line, 16 miles of wire strung through the dense forest, across swamps and rocks, to connect this woodland enclave to the global nervous system of civilization. Imagine the contrast. A guest, sitting in a chair made of twigs, could pick up the receiver and hear the voice of his Wall Street broker on the other end. He could exist in the illusion of complete unity with nature, while still keeping a finger on the pulse of his financial empire. The telephone and electricity at Sagamore were not just technologies, they were instruments of control. They allowed for the creation of a perfect hybrid world, a world where one could enjoy primordial silence, but never lose the power that comes with instant communication. This was the very essence of the great camp's philosophy: to take from the wild its beauty, but to strip it of its greatest power, the ability to isolate and make a man feel small. Vanderbilt didn't just build a house in the woods, he created a technological bubble, inside which the laws of nature applied only insofar as he allowed them to. He conquered the darkness, he conquered the silence. He became the master not only of the land, but of energy itself. The illusion of solitude is the most expensive of pleasures. And for Alfred Vanderbilt's 20 guests to enjoy the feeling that they were alone in the world, they were served by an army of nearly 50 people. For this theater of luxury to run flawlessly, an entire city was built behind the scenes, a city for servants. It was a parallel world, a mirror image of the guest areas of Sagamore. The masters had exquisite guest cabins. The staff had modest but functional dormitories. The masters had a gigantic dining hall with a stone fireplace. The staff had their own separate dining hall, where conversations were quieter and the food was simpler. The architecture of this invisible city was the architecture of social control. Everything was designed so that the two worlds would not intersect. Separate laundries, one for washing wine-stained tablecloths, the other for sweat-soaked work clothes. Separate ice houses for storing champagne and for the staff's provisions. Even the paths in the forest were part of this system of segregation. Wide, gravel-strewn paths for the guests, leading to the lake, the tennis court, or the bowling alley. And narrow, inconspicuous trails for the servants, allowing them to move like ghosts between the kitchen, the laundry, and the guest houses without being seen by their masters. This invisible city lived by its own laws and its own strict schedule. Its day began long before the guests woke up and ended deep after midnight, when the last glasses were washed and the hunting boots were polished to a shine. There was a strict hierarchy here. At the top was the manager, below him the head gamekeeper, the chef, and the head housekeeper. And at the very bottom were the nameless laundresses, stokers, and errand boys. This division was not just a practical necessity. It was a philosophy which dictated that the labor providing the luxury must be invisible. The guests were only to see the result: a perfectly made bed, a fire burning in the hearth, a dinner served on time. They were not to see the tired faces, the calloused hands, and the dozens of people whose sole purpose was to make their vacation flawless. Sagamore wasn't just one camp. It was two camps, existing side by side, but separated by an invisible wall. One was bathed in light, filled with laughter and music. The other was hidden in the shadows, operating like a well-oiled machine. And without this second, invisible city, the first would not have lasted a single day. it would have simply collapsed under the weight of its own helplessness. This man-made paradise was built from the most vulnerable material one could find in the forest: wood. Each of Sagamore's 27 buildings, from the main lodge to the woodshed, was essentially a giant powder keg, waiting for a single stray spark. And the greatest enemy of this forest kingdom did not live outside. It lurked within: fire. This fear was a constant, invisible guest in every room. It hid in the dozens of fireplaces that devoured firewood around the clock. It lurked in the coal furnaces that fed the steam heating system. It lived in the kerosene lamps and in the imperfect, hastily laid electrical wiring. One mistake by a stoker, one glowing ember falling onto a bearskin rug, and Vanderbilt's dream could turn to ash in a matter of hours. The awareness of this fragility turned Sagamore not just into a camp, but into a veritable fortress built for war with fire. It was the invisible, but most crucial, engineering system of the entire complex. Giant water tanks were positioned throughout the grounds like sentinels. They were fed by the lake and were ready at a moment's notice to unleash tons of water on any blaze. The most modern equipment of the time was purchased: powerful steam pumps, hundreds of feet of fire hose, axes, and hooks. But the equipment was nothing without people. Sagamore had its own, highly trained fire brigade. By day, they were ordinary workers: carpenters, stable hands, gamekeepers. But at the sound of an alarm, they transformed into a coordinated unit, each member knowing their role. They conducted regular drills, practicing their actions until they were automatic, because everyone understood. In this wilderness, far from any help, they could only rely on themselves. Response time was measured not in minutes, but in seconds. This constant crushing fear of destruction reveals the central truth of Sagamore. It was a desperate attempt to create an island of absolute control in the midst of the uncontrollable chaos of the wild. But even here, in their perfectly ordered world, its creators could not escape the feeling of their own vulnerability. They could command the land, the water, and the electricity, but they could not repeal the laws of physics. They could not make wood non-flammable. And this wooden fortress, built as a symbol of eternal power and permanence, was in fact a monument to fragility. It reminded its master every minute that his paradise was hanging by a thread, and that the fire that warmed his guests could, at any moment, become the fire that destroyed it all. If one had to choose a single building that embodies the entire essence, all the brilliance, and all the absurdity of Sagamore, this would be it. Not the main lodge, not the dining hall, but the open-air bowling alley. This structure is the crowning achievement of the primitive luxury philosophy, the apotheosis of the idea that there is no whim that money cannot satisfy, even in the most impassable wilderness. Picture the scene. It's evening. Alfred Vanderbilt's guests, men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns with trains, emerge from the illuminated dining hall. The air is filled with the scent of pine and expensive perfume. They walk along a covered walkway to play a game of bowling. But this is no ordinary bowling alley. The walls of this building are open. As the players swing the heavy ball, they look not at a dreary wall, but at the wild, dark forest from which comes the hooting of an owl and the crack of a branch under the paw of an unseen beast. It was a surreal theater, where a parlor game came face to face with primordial nature. And the absurdity didn't end there. Inside this theater was its own hidden mechanism. In the city clubs of the time, automatic ball return systems were already appearing. But here, in this forest utopia, everything was done the old-fashioned way. At the other end of the two lanes, in the semi-darkness, sat young boys, local kids, hired for a few cents an hour. Their job was to jump down after each throw, manually gather the heavy pins, set them up in a perfect triangle, and then roll the ball back down a special chute. They were living automatons, invisible cogs in this entertainment machine. This picture is the quintessence of the Gilded Age. Aristocrats in silks and diamonds, playing what is essentially a plebeian game against a backdrop of wild nature, all made possible by the manual, low-paid labor of children. The bowling alley at Sagamore was not just an amusement, it was a manifesto. It declared, "We are so detached from reality that we can afford this whim. We can bring a city pastime into the forest. We can make nature our backdrop, and the local people our servants." It was the most vivid, most grotesque symbol of how far this game of living the simple life had gone. A game in which the rules were set only by those who could afford to build a bowling alley in the middle of nowhere. The construction was complete. The wooden fortress stood firm. An army of servants had been trained and assigned to their posts. Electricity had conquered the darkness, and the telephone, the silence. The stage was set. All that remained was to begin the main performance for which this all had been created. A performance titled The Life of an Aristocrat. And the main act in this play, the most prestigious entertainment, was the hunt. For the men of the Gilded Age, hunting was not just a sport, it was a ritual, a symbol of dominion over the wild world, a proof of masculinity, a chance to feel like a pioneer without sacrificing comfort. But the hunts at Sagamore were rarely a fair contest between man and beast. It was, rather, a meticulously staged killing, a theatrical production with a predetermined finale. Long before a distinguished guest, be it a Rockefeller or some European noble, took an expensive rifle in hand, another, unseen team went to work. Professional gamekeepers and guides who knew this forest like the back of their hands. For weeks, they would comb through thousands of acres, tracking the largest deer, the most powerful bear. They studied its habits, its trails, its feeding grounds. Their task was not simply to find the animal. Their task was to gently, without startling it, guide it into the right area, to herd it into a zone convenient for the shot. And so, on the appointed day, the guest would be led down a specially cleared path. He would be told of the hardships and dangers of the wild. He felt like a hero who had challenged the elements. And then, at the right moment, the guide would point him to the target, to a magnificent beast which appeared exactly where it was supposed to, like an actor stepping onto the stage on the director's cue. A shot, a trophy, adulation. And in the evening, tales by the fireplace of bravery, of luck, of the struggle with the wild forest. This staged hunt was the perfect metaphor for all of life at Sagamore. It was an illusion of struggle, an illusion of overcoming, an illusion of authenticity. The guests believed they were conquering nature, when in fact, nature had already been conquered for them by an army of invisible helpers. The stage was set. The actors had taken their places. The final touch had been applied. Alfred Vanderbilt's forest kingdom was fully built. It was perfect, flawless, and completely artificial. He had built his fortress, but he failed to consider that the greatest threat would not come from the outside, not from this managed and conquered forest. It would come from within, from the chaos of human passion and the inexorable march of history itself, which cannot be cornered like a deer. Sagamore came to life. It ceased to be a construction site and was transformed into a stage. Music poured from its windows, glasses clinked on the verandas, and silent canoes glided across the lake. But this was not life. It was a performance. Life here was governed not by the cycle of day and night, but by a strict schedule, an unwritten but ironclad code of conduct. Mornings were for hunting or fishing, afternoons for tennis or horseback riding, and evenings, a sacred ritual, the ritual of dressing for dinner. In the middle of a wild forest, hundreds of miles from the nearest city, men would don tuxedos and women, Parisian evening gowns. It was a prison of etiquette, erected in the midst of a kingdom of freedom. The walls of Sagamore didn't confine, they commanded. This architecture demanded that one live up to it. One could not sit in worn-out clothes by a fireplace built like an altar. One could not eat simple food in a dining hall reminiscent of a feasting hall from a Norse saga. And the food was not simple. Every oyster, delivered here by special train from New York, every bubble in a glass of champagne, was part of this performance. A performance starring the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and the entire financial aristocracy of America. But was it a place of happiness? Or was it the world's most beautiful gilded cage? Alfred was not the master of the house. He was a director, obsessed with creating a perfect world where everything submitted to his will. And he created it. But this man-made paradise, designed to hide a man from the world, could not hide him from himself. The perfect set cracked. A major scandal destroyed his first marriage when his wife caught him with his mistress. The news was in all the papers. The impeccable facade of a gentleman crumbled, exposing common, sordid human passions. And Sagamore, his refuge, his fortress of silence, suddenly found itself at the epicenter of a hurricane of public humiliation. He tried to escape the shadow of his predator ancestors, but was trapped by his own nature. He had built the perfect stage for a perfect life, but he himself destroyed the play. After the divorce, he continued to play his part, the part of the generous host, the king of his forest world. But now, there was a note of desperation in the performance. He tried to hide the emptiness and bitterness of defeat behind the glitter of receptions and the luxury of dinners. He did not yet know that his most important, most sincere, and final appearance on stage would take place far from here, and its backdrop would not be the peaceful forests, but a roaring, icy ocean. May 7th, 1915. This day was supposed to be just another page in the society columns. The luxurious liner Lusitania was making another transatlantic voyage. On board, the cream of society. Among them, Alfred Vanderbilt. He was traveling to England for a horse show, to his greatest passion. His entire life up to that point had been a series of privileges. He was born with a fortune that spared him the need to fight for his place in the sun. He was surrounded by servants who anticipated his every wish. His world was one of absolute safety. He was a man who had never in his life experienced genuine animal fear. But at 10 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, his world collapsed. A muffled thud shook the giant ship. A German torpedo, fired from the U-20 submarine, had pierced the hull. And in an instant, the luxurious floating palace turned into hell. Chaos and panic reigned on the deck. Screams of terror mingled with the screech of metal. Aristocrats and common passengers, men, women, children, all became equal in the face of death. And in that moment, something incredible happened. Alfred Vanderbilt, the man who had lived his entire life in a cocoon of egoism and comfort, the man whose grandfather had thrown the phrase, "the public be damned," in the world's face. This man committed an act that would forever pull him from the shadow of his ancestors. Witnesses recounted that he was one of the calmest people on board, as if his entire previous, empty, and decorative life had been but a preparation for these 18 minutes. He saw a woman with an infant who couldn't find a life jacket, Without a moment's hesitation, he took off his own and gave it to her. He knew perfectly well that he was signing his own death warrant. In the icy water, without a life jacket, he didn't stand a chance. But he didn't stop there. Along with another millionaire, he began to systematically help women and children into the lifeboats. He organized the bewildered people, calmed the crying. He, the heir to a dynasty of predators, became a shepherd to his doomed flock. According to survivors, his last words to his companion were, "Let's save the kiddies." This was his turning point, his moment of truth. The man who had spent his whole life trying to build an artificial paradise for himself, in the final minutes of his life, sacrificed himself to save others in a real hell. All the phoniness, all the glitter of the Gilded Age, all the tuxedos and candlelit dinners, all of it burned away in the fire of true heroism. When the Lusitania went under, taking nearly 1,200 lives with her, she also took Alfred Vanderbilt. But his death was not an end, but a beginning, the beginning of a legend. And that legend forever changed the spirit of Sagamore. It ceased to be merely the home of a rich playboy. Now, it was a place that belonged to a hero. His ghost, his final, most noble act, took up permanent residence within these walls, filling them with a meaning they never had during his life. Control of the forest empire passed into the hands of his widow, Margaret, but he would forever remain its unseen master. The death of Alfred Vanderbilt should have been the end of an era, but instead, a new party began. His widow, Margaret, heiress to the bromo-seltzer fortune, was a woman of a different breed. She didn't seek silence, she craved life, and under her guidance, Sagamore experienced its second and loudest golden age. The ghost of her heroic husband sanctified the place, while his widow filled it with jazz and laughter. The roaring 20s had arrived. During Prohibition, when the rest of America lived under the weight of restrictions, Sagamore transformed into an impregnable oasis of hedonism. Far from the eyes of the police, within its walls, alcohol flowed freely, and parties roared until dawn. But all parties must come to an end. The era was fading, and with it, Margaret was growing old. In 1954, she sold Sagamore. The era of private ownership was over. The camp was passed to Syracuse University, becoming a conference center. From a palace of pleasure, it became an institution of learning. Then, in 1975, the university sold the land to the state of New York, and with that stroke of the pen, its death warrant was signed. In the state constitution, there was an article, sacred to conservationists, the Forever Wild Clause. It stipulated that any land belonging to the Adirondack Forest Preserve must remain untouched. No buildings, no trace of man. The law, designed to protect nature, demanded that history be wiped from the face of the earth. The bulldozers were already warming their engines. And then, a new hero entered the scene. Not a millionaire, not an aristocrat, a historian and activist named Howard Kirschenbaum. He saw in Sagamore not just a pile of old logs, but a unique monument to American history that had to be saved. He began his war, a war fought not with money, but with persuasion. It was a desperate 8-year battle, a battle fought in courtrooms, in government offices, on the pages of newspapers. Kirschenbaum and his supporters achieved the nearly impossible. They made the state see Sagamore not as junk, but as a treasure. The deal was struck at the last minute, when all seemed lost. And here it is, the final greatest irony in the history of this place. Sagamore, the greatest monument to private power and exclusivity, built to wall itself off from the public, survived only when it became public property. It was saved not by money, but by the passion of ordinary people. It teaches us that a true legacy isn't what you build for yourself in isolation. It's what you give to the world in a moment of truth. Alfred Vanderbilt understood this in the final moments of his life, saving children on a sinking ship. His creation of wood and stone learned this lesson decades later, when it was saved from destruction and given to us all. And the ultimate question it asks us is this: can a creation, born of ego and the desire for escape, find true value and redeem its origins only when it ceases to belong to its creator and is shared with the world? This story isn't about logs and stones. It's the story of the world's most expensive attempt to buy silence with money that smelled of steel and blood. A man built a fortress to hide from his own name, but in the end, that very fortress became a monument to how he transcended it in his final hour. But can a creation, born of ego and a desire to escape, redeem its origins? And do we find our true worth not when we build walls for ourselves, but only in the moment we hand over the keys to the world? The answer to that question is for each of us to find. Your thoughts in the comments are the continuation of our story. And if it made you think, your like and subscription will be the best sign that stories like this need to be told.